So, in case you're wondering, kind of that's what it's all about. That's an Hiroshima-sized bomb fired out of a cannon in 1953. It was the only experiment, test explosion of that kind, but it kind of can focus what our discussion is about today. Rather than going into a lengthy lecture, which I'll probably get into with lengthy questions and answers, I just thought I'd start off just by asking you guys for a few questions that I can respond to, that I can riff off. Otherwise, I could drone on for hours and you'll perhaps fall asleep. So, any questions for me? What brought you here today? What do you want to know?
As someone who's worked in the UN proliferation organization, so I can't remember the title of, what's your take on the nuclear weapons testing and mass production done by Kim Jong in North Korea?
North Korea. We're here about Ukraine, but okay, I can do Korea. Any more? And if you give us sorry, just give a name and course. This helps the place.
Sorry, it's Rami doing the online distance learning for global diplomacy.
Oh, cool, great, welcome.
My name is Ankit. I'm doing the LLM in International Law Felix Scholarship. My question is about the legal strategy that Russia has adopted in the courts and the tribunals to counter or at least present a counter narrative, not guns, but in legal terms. Now,
okay,
that's where my trajectory is going with respect to the question.
So, Korean programs, Russian perspectives on international law, down the front.
I'm Prajwal, I'm doing international studies and diplomacy. My question is, how would NATO respond if Putin indeed uses a nuclear weapon in Ukraine?
Okay, couple more maybe.
Ben, global diplomacy, East Asia. If there was an agreement made towards nuclear disarmament, how much do you think it would risk the return of world-scale conflicts such as World War I and World War II due to the absence of deterrence?
Okay, anything over here?
Nick, IDPP.
Sorry?
Nick, IDPP. What do you think is the best deterrent for the West to use in terms of Putin, but also other actors in the nuclear club?
Okay, please.
I'm international diplomacy. I was wondering, is there technically for Putin and Russia, is there any strategic use of a nuclear war, or would that just bring disadvantages?
Yeah, okay. Please.
What do you think of the firewalls within Russia to prevent the use of nuclear power?
Firewalls in Russia. Okay, that's a good spectrum. I'm not an expert on international law in general. As far as I'm aware, the Russians, Putin has sought to claim, without I don't think any real basis in international law, that these various provinces of Ukraine are Russia, and has now announced, and the Russian Duma has announced they are Russia. Now, in the 19th century, early 20th century, this is fairly common practice, but since the UN Charter, this is not regarded as legal, and indeed regarded as a fundamental breach of the Charter. So, and I'm not aware of the Russians launching any particular claims about the legality, except insofar as they talk about mistaken decisions of previous Russian governments. With respect to the DPRK, North Korea, one of our board members negotiated a deal with the North Koreans, the agreed framework, which would have prevented North Koreans getting nuclear weapons, and the Republicans in Congress trashed it, as a result of which the North Koreans went again anyway and got nuclear weapons. So now North Korea is a de facto nuclear weapon state with missiles, rather like, let's say, Pakistan or Israel. And that presents a whole different set of of issues. Other questions I think related more directly to Ukraine and NATO and prevention and so forth. And I guess I would, in a way, answer, I was one of those people who thought 200,000 Russian troops, which is all the whole Russian army, hasn't got really any chance of taking over a country of 40 million people in Ukraine if they don't want it to happen. But I was wrong. Putin had to go. And I think the problem one faces with respect to a number of these questions is that the rationality of leaders and people around them is very often leads to disastrous results. After all, the Germans started 2 world wars and lost both of them. The Americans thought they could have a short, jolly war in Iraq and were defeated. So the problem one faces is that while we can see, well, Putin's saying various things and what he's saying is vague, but there are plenty of people in the West who will, after all, we all want to get on television and, you know, get our articles published, who will jump on any remark and, you know, make a great deal out of it. And he, you don't know what his motivations are, or people around him, and the people on television are kind of a Russian equivalent of Fox News on steroids. They are forever saying all sorts of extremely provocative and aggressive things. How far they reflect policy and action is hard to say, and maybe that's part of the point. Maybe part of the point is to confuse. Maybe the Ukrainians and the Americans have decided with this level of bluster, they should soft pedal on Ukrainian counteroffensives. We don't know. But I think what we do know is that the rational models that make up so much of analysis, and I can deconstruct a few of them. One is people talk about, well, if he uses a nuclear weapon, and uses a nuclear weapon in 1 or 4 different precise scenarios. Well, who's to say it's going to be a nuclear weapon? Who's to say it's going to work? Maybe they'll launch half a dozen that land in the wrong place if they get round to it. Maybe they can't rely upon their shorter range. No one should use the word tactical, the sort of tactical. It's a real misnomer. But maybe the shorter range ones, which are in central storage at locations in Russia and have to be transported and, I love the sexual analogy, mated with the missile. You'll find this sort of language unconsciously is used throughout this business. So, well, we can't rely on all of that, so we're going to have to use one of our longer range rockets in a silo or on a submarine, because that's what we can rely upon. But then suddenly, well, they're using a strategic weapon. And maybe, well, it's got 9 warheads on, so maybe 3 of them work and 6 of them don't, and 2 of them land in the wrong place. And maybe one of them by accident lands in NATO. So this idea of rational, clearly defined circumstances, which is why I think Biden was on the money when he said, you know, once you start this, who knows where it's going to end? You can't rationally control it. But there are plenty of, you know, academic colleagues of mine who spent lifetimes writing about ladders of escalation and different precise delineations of deterrence. And to my mind, the real world doesn't work like that. And there are enough former military officers, former nuclear missile commanders, with whom, some of whom I've had the pleasure of working with over the years, who would say, yeah, well, these movies like Dr. Strangelove are much more real than anyone wants to admit, because confusion is reality. And if there's one example to throw at you, for example, now you get, well, how is Russia's experience or the experience of Russia and nuclear weapons and nuclear threats going to inform how China approaches Taiwan, for example? Oh, there's a good 600 words and an op-ed immediately. But question for the crowd, what was the one occasion this century in which a superpower's centers of power in its own country came under attack? When in this century did the centers of power in one of the superpowers come under attack? 9/11, the top of the class, thank you. One of the issues I throw out to my class is find any, and on that occasion, one can show that there was intense confusion at the heart of the American government. The American government has spent 60 years developing procedures. What happens if the Russians attack us with nuclear weapons? You know, we send the Secretary of Defense to this secret location. We set up this protocol for that eventuality. We call on these fighter jets to do that. All of that collapsed on 9/11. It wasn't even a nuclear attack. I mean, it was a very severe attack. It was a surprise, at least it shouldn't have been, but it was a surprise to the centers of power. Now, one of my challenges for my students is go away and find me any analysis that relates the events of 9/11 to a nuclear crisis or a major superpower crisis. And there aren't any. I've been asked, I never thought there were, and I've been asking colleagues in the States and elsewhere, now what does it tell you if your, what in the jargon of IR, if your entire strategic culture cannot analyze something as obvious as that? There's not a dissertation at King's College or at Yale I've been able to find written in the last 20 years. You can find studies about how fire services and police should better manage catastrophes. Yeah, that's fine. It's useful, important, but not. And then you can probably write, you know, several doctoral theses on why not. Why is there this silence? And certainly now, nobody in the West particularly wants to say, well, the problem is we might stuff it up. If it all goes wrong, it's all about how the Russians will do something irrational, and then what are our options? Not how chaotic things might be. If you can queue up the battle deck, we can go to the battle deck shortly. Which goes to the question of how would they react? Well, short answer is no one knows. Some of my former colleagues are now quite senior positions in NATO and elsewhere, and you hope that they will react in a considered manner. But one can also say, leaving aside the politics of, well, did this happen before or after the midterm elections? I mean, you don't want to look soft on the fence. So you've got to crank up to condition red, whatever it might be, just to show how tough we are. And it's all in Dr. Strangelove. That the political and psychological pressures and media pressures to enact revenge, to escalate, I would expect be enormous. There will be lots of people going around, for goodness sake, we don't want to get into a nuclear war unless we really have to, do we? But there will also be a huge noise for an aggressive response, which, you know, doesn't bode well for a more peaceful outcome. Unfashionably, I would think that there's a problem which I spent quite a bit of time working on, which is that for some time neither the Chinese or Russian leadership think they have the ability to use their nuclear weapons if the United States attacks them first with conventional weapons. But American conventional weapons are so numerous, so fast, so precise, that the Russians and the Chinese are very concerned that they don't have any ability to retaliate. if the Americans just use conventional weapons. Now, I wouldn't want to stake my mortgage on it or my house, presumably it's still standing. But that is a big concern in Moscow and China, which you don't read much about in the Western press. So I think when if you look at the small print of articles written about what do we do if, and you find former commanders or officials writing, in the middle of the small print, they say, well, NATO would use its overwhelming conventional supremacy. It's what? Excuse me, I thought the Russians were coming. I thought we barely had a couple of bows and arrows, and the Russians were, had huge strength. Oh, we have overwhelming conventional supremacy, do we? How interesting. Occasionally in those debates, you get a glimpse of NATO capability. The Finns, for example, recently joining NATO, but they have already bought 60 plus brand new American fighter jets with stealth cruise missiles on, able to hit Moscow. The Japanese have similarly acquired an ability to hit Beijing with conventional weapons from outside China. And this doesn't get any airtime in Western media at all. But you can believe it does in the general staffs in Moscow and Beijing. And going to the question of brakes or fire brakes on Putin, there may not be any. And there may be people around him, even if they were, who were just determined to go for it because they see themselves, let us say, in an equivalence of Britain at Dunkirk in 1940, that their worldview is that they are hemmed in, attacked, and under threat. All they can do is lash out. And they believe their own rhetoric. On the other hand, there may be the historic business that the Russians don't have a unified one commander with the button, that they have to have 2 or 3 people to fire. The Defense Secretary and the Chief of Staff. That those people in the rocket forces decide that they don't want to start a nuclear war. And by the way, the only reason we're all here today is because at various points historically, American and Russian officers have received the order to fire nuclear weapons and have gone, you know what? Not today. And on occasion, they've had to draw their pistols on their colleagues to stop it happening. And there are a good half a dozen plus documented instances of this in the last sort of 50 years or so. And you can be sure, just by the nature of things, that if we know about half a dozen, there's probably another half a dozen out there that we don't know about. There's some logic in that, I think, given imperfect information. So a fire break against Putin actually doing the deed, I wouldn't want to bank on at all. They may be there, but they may not be. There may be, a strong NATO conventional response. It may be decided, well, if the Russians have used nuclear weapons, then they must be attacked and prevented from doing anything further. And you can see the political logic in that, which is they've done something mad, we have to make sure they can't do anything madder. And even if there is a risk of things getting worse, then leaving them be will be even more dangerous. You can see that argument being played out. So I would not, the bottom line being, I would not bet against this happening. I don't want to. I didn't want to think that Putin would attack Ukraine. I was wrong. He thought that 200,000 would walk in and be showered with flowers as they walked into Kiev, in the same way as Donald Rumsfeld thought that American troops would be met with flowers in Baghdad. They were both wrong. So that's kind of my few minutes on part of those questions. Have we got the battle deck? Hooray. A few years ago, I was out at US Strategic Command. And if probably seen The Wolf of Wall Street, the other movies, and maybe you've been in dealing rooms. And who knows what it's like in Russia, but this is American television insight into the command center of American nuclear forces at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. Shall we have that one?
There's a lot of history here in this center.
And deep underground at Offutt Air Force Base, today's history is being monitored behind these huge brass doors. Welcome to the GOC, U.S. Stratcom's Global Operations Center.
Very often, a satellite will be the first to launch.
Air Force Brigadier General John Shaw is its deputy commander. Now, recently, Stratcom gave KETV News Watch 7 rare access to the center, where America's military watches the world. Like when North Korea fires its missiles. That would be detected within seconds by satellite, radar, or both.
Satellite will pick up the infrared signature of a launch of a missile, and you'll see that pretty quick. But the radar gives you a continuous, pinging of that missile as it's going. Gets you a really good idea where it's going.
That tracking and potential impact information is then displayed on one of the large map monitors that surround the room.
And then we would have that information available, and as necessary, up-channel that information to our military and our national leadership.
Now, Global Ops isn't concerned only with rocket launches, but also by attacks launched from keyboards and beyond.
What we are doing on the space and cyber domains is taking up the far majority of our time of what we do on a day-to-day basis. And that's maybe what escapes a lot of people.
Absolutely. It is a no-fail mission.
Air Force Colonel Bobby Buells, an Omaha native, is the Battle Watch commander.
On a day-to-day basis, sir, I would say the most difficult part of the job is understanding the full spectrum of responsibilities that U.S. Stratcom has.
Responsibilities that require a full spectrum of experts, both military and civilian.
To be able to provide that best advice that we then up-channel to the commander of U.S. Stratcom to be able to provide that situational awareness that he needs to do his job.
A job that sometimes requires a conference here, one floor above the GOC, on the battle deck.
We would establish a conference here that can be dialed into by other military leaderships, by our National Military Command Center, which then could even bring in the president as necessary.
Now, the time we were in the Global Operations Center, things were calm. That's how they like it. But with hotspots always popping up around the world and the security of our country on the line, the GOC has to always be online.
I tell you, as long as there are security challenges to the United States and its allies, and I don't see those going away anytime soon, the Global Operations Center is going to be a key part of the defense against such threats.
Interested in your reaction to that and what I've said so far, but I think over time, my concern is that despite the professionalism of those involved and the presumed equivalent professionalism in Russian military command and command centers, the complexity and the scope for confusion and miscalculation in that kind of environment is extremely high. And the presumption that we have that we will do this and they will do that and there will be this rational process, I think that's profound. That's wishful thinking, I think. I wish it wasn't. But I think this is a much more troublesome future. Certainly, when I was in those rooms myself, I had this overwhelming sense of, the military equivalent of a trading floor in the stock exchange. And so the intensity of emotion, presumably won't be coke fueled, they'll all be drug tested rather than unlike the City of London or Wall Street. But nevertheless, I think a not reassuring environment. So that's my first round of Q&A. Should we head to the bar or have another round or two?
Hasnan from International Politics.
Yeah.
How do you think that the coming winter would change the dynamics of the war in Ukraine? Do you think that it would actually aggravate the situation? And
Okay.
how the West will try to, manage its energy crisis, particularly?
Yes. 1, 2, 3, 4, half a dozen. So people haven't asked before. Did you ask first round? No, go on.
Should people who want to prevent nuclear war from happening want Putin to be kicked out of power or even assassinated or something? The idea that you're not going to take by someone who's really mad.
Hold on to nurse for fear of worse.
Yes, probably.
Yeah, that's the threat. Yes. We'll come to the winter in a second.
Based on what's happened from February to now, what do you think about what's going on? What is your take on Putin's mindset or what you've seen till now?
Did you ask for a first round? Go on. Okay, go on.
Seen my study EA progress.
Okay.
Question was, what do you think of NATO expansion to East Europe in the past 20 years?
Okay.
So my name is Jayant. I'm studying advanced studies and diplomacy, MA. And my question is basically looking at the national security strategy, which recently came out from the US and which was very, very text heavy, but very abstract when we look at the parts which mention NPT, non-proliferation, and how they just support the CPT, NPT, IAEA, and then looking at the section on how are they tackling the Russian issue, where they said that they are strongly siding by NATO and other European allies supporting Ukraine. And since then, the German embassy was under attack and the building was attacked by Russia. So the German, which was housing the German embassy, which basically means that it is an attack on Germany. So will NATO retaliate to that attack?
Where was the German embassy attack?
In Kiev, near Kiev, in Ukraine.
I think it was evacuated when the bomb hit.
Yeah, they left when the war started too.
They were evacuated, but
Historically, countries don't regard attacks on their embassies as, although they are sovereign territory, they don't regard them as a real attack on their territory. About 30 years ago, I was asked by the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee to come and give evidence on NATO expansion, and for reasons which are all too obvious, testified that it was a bad idea. The fact that it was a bad idea doesn't excuse what the Russians have done. I think that's important. And there were plenty of other options, but it was not a wise course of action. And when Putin came knocking on the door to join NATO, he should not have been brushed off. The Chinese might not like it, but this should have. The answer was always to make a deal with the big power, so the small countries in between stop panicking. That was always the obvious answer. But unfortunately, there were Polish Americans who were very much running a policy in Washington, the Brzezinskis in particular. So that got pushed aside. You're asking about the winter, I think. Well, you're asking me to giving a talk like this, I'm required to keep gazing into my crystal ball. For those of you that care, I tweeted into the blizzard and the void in April that I thought that the implications of the Russian attack would be that the Russian position in the south would collapse, and this would call into question the Russian Federation, and that we would see a heating up of frozen conflicts across the Caucasus and further east. And that to a degree has started to happen. Tajikistan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, although I think external powers have quietened them down in the short term. But about a month ago, those frozen conflicts, or cooler conflicts, reopened. At one level, I guess I overestimated the Ukrainian ability to counterattack. But I think at another level, the entire Russian standing army, responsible for everything from the Baltic states to Vladivostok, was only about 250,000 men. An entire force has now been used up, killed, exhausted in Ukraine. So the ability of the Russian, I think it was sometime in April or May, I noticed that a Russian Marine assault unit from Vladivostok had been reported to have been semi-destroyed in Ukraine. Well, if at that point, which is now 6 months ago, the Russians were needing to deploy naval units from the Far East to sustain their attack, it was an indication that, I remember the Syrians were supposed to be sending an army. What happened to that lot? Which is a bit like the Americans invading Iraq and deciding 1 month in that they needed to get some paramilitaries from Colombia to help them out. You know, demonstrably humiliating. Demonstrably, and obviously also not a game changer. You know, whatever these militias were, they were going to have major power. So I also think the assumption going back to World War II is that you can't fight in the winter. I think the Ukrainians will fight in the winter. The Russians are desperately under-equipped. It is an impoverished analog force, badly trained, that doesn't have night vision equipment. Now, one side can fight at night, and the other side can't. That's a huge, huge problem, and that's been the case all the way through. So I would see further Russian collapse, and perhaps not as quickly as you might like, but it's very hard to see where the Russians get from. You wanted to?
Yeah, just very quickly on that. I mean, the fact that the Russians targeted various power plants in Ukraine, how much effect will that have on the winter around this time?
Well, the Ukrainians say that their electric power industry is being hit hard. But otherwise, these attacks that blow up a random office block don't really have much effect on the outcome of the conflict. They may frighten people. Obviously, you know, my mum was blown up by a Nazi missile in Covent Garden in 1945. Survived, obviously, not quite that old. So, you know, that's something to some extent in my life experience. So I don't want to belittle it. And clearly the war is disgustingly horrible for the people engaged in it. Nevertheless, these drones and other attacks, unless they do succeed really in knocking out more power, but even then, you know, I think there is a sense in Europe that people will do what it takes to get through, and the extent the flexibility of Western industrial society when it's under threat, I think is easy to underestimate. The Germans have moved very fast to produce alternative natural gas supplies and so on and so forth. So is that a partial answer?
Yeah, and well, what about also the fact that the Russians have appointed this new general to be in charge of the operation?
They appointed new generals.
Well, one new general, I can't remember his name. Any difference?
Well, I wouldn't want to say any, none, but it's a completely different planet, really. But the American, the winning general in the American Civil War, General Grant, wrote a wonderful autobiography, which I do recommend to you because it's incredibly readable, about how he won the Civil War with the slave-owning South. And it puts you into a different world. But essentially, it's all about human resources, propaganda, and supplies, and technology. And whatever the general might be, some of the slave-owning generals were quite skillful generals, but at the end of the day, they didn't have the industrial infrastructure, and the NATO equipment is vastly superior to the Russians. And you see I think the Ukrainian news management is brilliant. You can't go on Twitter without seeing some soldier with a kitten, or some incredibly well made maiden, firing a rocket. I mean, they're brilliant. But nevertheless, they do appear to be disciplined, uniformed, equipped. And then you see, people as old and fat as me, struggling to get into their combats on the Russian side and put straight into the mill. And I think that is continuing to be a huge problem. They never had sufficient military, and what they have, they've burned up. And I think because for decades there has been in the West a huge investment in the Russian threat, and before that the Soviet threat, there was never any mileage to be, if you were an intelligence officer, to say, excuse me, General, I've done my analysis and I think they're rubbish. Because it doesn't fit. You're not going to go and get another few billion from Congress or from the MOD if you're providing an accurate analysis of how bad the Russians are. And there are some people out there who specialize in tires. I think this chap on Twitter specialized in tires. He's moved into other issues. but the decades-old equipment or centuries-old equipment on occasion. And by the way, one shouldn't get sucked in totally. You see some of the Russian conscripts going off with bolt-action rifles, first made in 1890. Yes, but that's also because the Russian officers and government don't trust the conscripts with modern machine guns until they get to the front line. They don't want to hand out weapons that can be used against them effectively. You have to look for other motivations. A bunch of other hands, but you wanted to come back on Mr. Winter.
Yes. So you said that the Russians now feel exhausted. Don't you think that increases the chance of a nuclear war breaking out in Ukraine, especially as a last stand for Russia, and especially because it's fighting the war on its border?
Yep.
All right.
Got to be too cheerful there. Gentleman there.
So can I ask about how do you view the British involvement in the situation? So for example, do you think an increase of GDP spend to 3% is justified in the situation here?
Okay.
And to follow up that, can you envisage an end game scenario? What do you think would happen? I mean, it's a very vague question.
Because you only got the easy ones. Certainly, if you look at the Independent and the Financial Times, I got a couple of quotes in that got rung up from the Madrid NATO conference. And by the way, the only other person I can find writing about this is the very esteemed Anthony Cordesman, who's a tremendous American military analyst, writing a few years ago, basically saying, what is this whole 2% business? Because we already outspend the Russians 17-1. Why spend another 2%? And that you want to talk about changing media debate, you know, if you want to care about these issues, come together and go after that one topic. Why every time someone says 2%, 2% why? Because we're already outspending them 17%. 10% is conservative. And so we're not getting value for money. The British contribution, I think politically and militarily very early on, was incredibly important in the supply of handheld anti-tank weapons and symbolically and in reaction, it helped stop the Russian attack on Kiev. And I think that was extremely important. And how that decision came about within the British government, I don't know. You know, whether it was military, whether it was the defense secretary, and I'm sure Mr. Johnson signed off on it, but I doubt it was his idea very much. And the British continue to make a significant contribution, but the British rhetoric is, I think, would make the Americans laugh, because the Americans are, you know, it's a decimal point or two difference in terms of what the United States is supplying than the British. But you also got, yes, there's a lot of training being done by the West now, but very rapidly, the Ukrainian military are the ones with the experience. Western experience is, 5 minutes or 6 months or so in counterinsurgency in Iraq and losing to the Taliban over 15 years at a very, very low intensity conflict. They don't have the experience that the Ukrainians now have in a World War II style conventional conflict. Go on, then, you've been patient. But no more international law. This is war crimes. I do a bit of war crimes.
Perhaps Dave Winter, as winter approaches, the law you want to classify everything. Perhaps how you can bracket this is that he wants to escalate to de-escalate. A fascinating article in The Economist spoke exactly about this. He has a rhetoric. The rhetoric is just plain rhetoric. It's not actually going to happen. Nuclear war is not going to happen. It's mutually assured destruction. Everybody loses. There was Biden as well. My question is it going to just become a proxy war as winter ends? Because neither of the countries can sustain a war for so long. It's going to affect economies. It's going to affect this economy as well. It's going to become tougher and tougher. It's going to become a proxy war. He's going to declare victory, and then he's going to battle for these regions which he's captured already, and then it's just going to go on from there as well. With weapons, since you mentioned weapons, the US is so intrinsically linked with their economy now. And if you go to Lockheed Martin's website, the first thing you see is how many jobs they've created. No politician would say we're going to cut spending, because cutting spending means losing jobs. Jobs go people don't vote. So it's just simple. No economy is going to sell this, produce weapons because it generates jobs. So I think that sort of explains why military spending and budgeting is never going to go down. And the inverse side is the DIY screen as well. Then they don't invest in the international system. And then if you don't invest in the international system, UN is not funded. UN is not funded. You can't even possibly start imagining a mandate or a court or a tribunal for war crimes in Russia, Ukraine. And the UN advisors have said exactly this. Now I've discussed it with them as well. So it's not going to happen unless there's a fundamental change of perspective. But in terms of foreign policy, it's just going to be escalate to de-escalate in terms of Putin. Is that something which is viable? Is that sort of a perspective which one can follow to make sense of anything that is happening and will happen from October onwards?
Well, there was an awful lot in your comment. I wish things were as rational as that. Yes, there are pressures. I think these escalate to de-escalate, these sorts of things don't belong in the real world. I mean, I spent some time with one of the early or first commanders-in-chief of STRATCOM, who did a lot of the disarmament. And he talked about scenario. I mean, two things in particular. We were talking about things one evening, an escalation and so forth. And he said, well, when I took over, I found out that the American Air Force and the American Navy never shared each other's nuclear war plans, ever. And that the American Pacific Fleet and the American Atlantic Fleet also never shared their nuclear war plans with each other. So in one scenario analysis, you assume, oh, well, there's kind of at least there's some level of rational command and control up to the center. But there wasn't. Until very recently, the STRATCOM had 15 subordinate commanders reporting to him at the same time. Imagine that in a real situation, how you deal with 15 people reporting to you in command and control. So escalate to de-escalate, it's a nice theory, and Western academics and commentators, love that sort of thing. But how far it relates to the real world, I think we've got to go back to my 9/11 example. If there was really rigorous analysis out there, there would be, a bunch of studies about how America reacted on 9/11 and what that means for crisis management and command and control. And you can be included in it. I have a prize for the students. Anyone who can come back and find some studies. And in terms of, yes, there are pressures for military spending, and I'm a great believer in supporting the UN. And yeah, one could have a rational and peaceful world much more rapidly. And yes, it needs a change of mindset. I vote for that. But we're looking at what's coming at us right now, and the ability of the system and leaders to generate chaos. And I'd say the presumption that we've got it all under control. They may be mad, but we've got it under control is one of the dangerous things. I'm not saying they're not mad, but similarly, your presumption that, well, Putin's rational and he'll do rational things. Well, at some level, it is rationality within a closed system that we don't subscribe to. That said to him, 200,000 people attacking Ukraine was going to be a bonzer idea. It was all going to be over in 72 hours, which he appeared to have convinced himself of. But hold on a tick. There were some others wanting to come in.
What do you think about Putin's state of mind?
Sorry?
Putin's state of mind.
I don't know.
What does it reveal?
I don't know about his state of mind. I mean, there are plenty of people who can write about it, and I know quite a lot of people who know him very well, or interacted with him a lot over the years. But as I say, if you're probably rational, you wouldn't have attacked. You would have realised that the February attack was going to be a disaster for you, your country, and everybody else. Please.
How much would you say Russia's relations with China? how much is China playing into that he has not yet?
Again, Western analysts like to make lots of assumptions from the outside, and I'm cautious about that. I think probably the Chinese, if asked, would have said, are you really sure? And now I think they, from a chess game perspective, the Chinese can look at the potential collapse of Russia and the Russian Federation and the drawing of greater parts of Western Eurasia into Western control, and that has to give them considerable pause for thought. If I had the time, I'd love to mentor someone to work on the Taiwan Straits nonsense, do a comparison between the D-Day landings of 1944 and Taiwan. 30-odd miles on a nice, lovely summer day with complete air superiority, complete naval supremacy, and you almost get back in your boats, or at least the Americans do. Even though there are lovely sandy beaches, you've got to manage getting on for 150 kilometers across the Taiwan Strait with no air superiority, no sea superiority, quite possibly the opposite. And you're landing on an urban sprawl coastline. You're going straight into urban warfare as soon as you hit the rocky, tiny beaches, the rocky shoreline of Taiwan. And the Americans and the Japanese have huge firepower, which one doesn't want to add. So I think the almost goading of Beijing over Taiwan is what I see happening, frankly. And the ability of them to actually do that is another different matter. But I'd be quite, if I was sitting in the People's Liberation Army, I wouldn't be feeling comfortable seeing what's happened. In the back.
The discussion of the proxy war, I'm going to ask you maybe push your powers of prediction a bit based on your understanding of history and international relations. How do you see this conflict ending? And if it doesn't end in a nuclear, bomb being detonated,
Bombs, plural.
bomb, yeah, exactly. How do you see it wrapping up, and when, and what is your thoughts around the end game?
Well, I said, put myself out there, when we mark dissertations, no, we don't do futurology, we don't do futurology, but we're here to do futurology. I put myself out there. I find it very hard to see how the Russian Federation as we know it survives in the coming years because of, it's a system that has relied upon nationalist ideology and force, and the force has crumbled. And more than the West wants to, Western analysts even now want to admit. As soon as the first attack into Kiev and Chernobyl airport failed, it was clear that the Russians were facing 200 kilometers of dead straight roads through forest, which turned into, a 50-kilometer junkyard quite quickly. But in a sense, if you've invested 40 years of your life in the Russian threat, it takes a while for that to sink in. Personally, I think the Russians, because of the attack on the bridge and other bridges, the Russians will just find themselves running out of everything you need. They're down just to fuel and ammunition. One of the reasons that you get so many abandoned vehicles is because they haven't got any fuel anymore. You have to walk away from them. Not just that their soldiers don't want to fight, which is also true. So at some point, the Ukrainians in some parts can just wait and watch them run out of stuff and continue to replenish their stocks. And then when you see the Russian position in these 4 provinces collapse more and more, and again, if you look at the ground west of Donetsk, the horrors of Mariupol, I don't know, it's about, 50K from western Donetsk, where the Ukrainians are already down to the coast. position for the Russians is pretty disastrous in every respect. So, yeah, might they go nuclear? Well, yes, indeed. And one question, you've been patient.
You're saying we weren't too much about nuclear war and not like about digital war.
About which war?
Digital war. Digital war.
Digital war. I think they are interconnected. And one of the very smart things the Biden administration did was to announce a moratorium on any kind of kinetic anti-satellite testing. Because the 21st century equivalent of the railway timetable is when things start to move, is when you start to have a lethal dance of satellites that control a lot of the digital technology. And that's when that is one of the signals that things really start to get out of control if you end up with a satellite dance over digital infrastructure. And that's also, the one nuclear weapon, well, it makes the blast hole in Ukraine. It also creates an electromagnetic pulse which can knock out large amounts of the world's electronics. Didn't mean to. Unintended consequences. However, an intended consequence of a Diet Coke we can have next door. Thank you very much.